Hello, hobby friends! I have a bunch of Space Marine Terminators that need painting, but before that I need a wet palette. I'm just using paper towel, printer paper, parchment paper stuff. I might upgrade in the future, but for now this is fine. Oh yeah, painting handles. When it comes to painting a mini, you really gotta get a handle on it. I like using blocks of Mega Blocks with flattened coils of masking tape up top. However, I've seen videos of people using double-sided foam tape, so let's try that. It's certainly easier to apply than the single-sided masking tape, that's for sure. With them applied, it's time to start painting Astartes. First, I slap gunmetal craft paint everywhere. And I mean everywhere. Even the places you don't think about. My custom chapter color scheme features blue broken up by many silver sections, so starting with metallics means I can get at least a third of the model painted pretty quickly. There are some sections that my black primer did not quite reach. No problem though. A healthy amount of thinned black paint will fix that. These missed areas are in the recessed, hard-to-reach places. It stands to reason that if I have trouble finding them upon close inspection, then anyone looking at them from above at a distance will never see them. So I don't feel the need to get them perfectly covered. I want to get to the next step already, which is silver. I'm applying Vallejo silver with mostly a downward overbrushing motion. The metallic nature of the paint hides any unsightly transitions that the overbrushing often makes. With my termies chromed out, it's time to eat some Chinese food. As cool as this lustrous silver looks, it's time to cover it up with some blue. My favorite Space Marine blue comes from mixing two miniature paints about half and half. Now as you can see here, just about all the blue sections that I'm base coating are protruding and are easy to reach. This is one of the reasons I did the silver first. Another reason is that the true metallic undercoat helps later base coats achieve better vibrancy and coverage. Since this blue miniature paint color covers pretty well to begin with, I can get away with only one semi-thinned coat in most places. For this scheme, I don't add any shadows to the blue. The silver is already pretty dark in places, so any shadow I add to the blue will likely blend it with the silver more than I'd like. To make a highlight color, I simply mix in some white. I like to use half and half ratios whenever possible. They're just easier to remember. I also put down some light blue craft paint that I'll try as a secondary highlight later. I place the brighter blue, making sure to leave space for a transition back to the original blue, while also leaving room to work up to the second highlight. To make this transition, I simply glaze the lighter blue towards where I applied it previously. Any areas that are left with a stark gap between the lighter and darker tones are fixed by glazing down with the original blue color. When it comes to edge highlighting, I decided to use this light blue instead of the brightest light blue I'll use later, because I think the edges would look awkward if they were too bright. The sky blue craft paint is applied in the same way as the first highlights, but only on the brightest areas of the gradients. I did have a bit of trouble using this paint though. Not because it's a bad paint, but because all craft paints lend themselves to layering rather than glazing, which is what I'm forcing it to do. Being a craft paint, this color is pretty translucent. I'm not sure, but I'm guessing that more opaque paints allow for faster glaze transitions. Not to worry. These highlights take up very little space in the mini, so applying multiple coats is quite quick. Though next time I will try miniature paint as the final highlight instead of this one. I also use this color to strategically highlight the edge highlight in places where I want it to pop. Awesome! All the blue is done. But wait, I still have 3 more. These two will be painted as Deathwatch, while this one I'm thinking Imperial Fists. 'Cause what's more Imperial Fist than a huge bolt gun and a giant fist? This Termi was my first time going to town with highlighting and shading, and a year later, I'm itching to try my hand at a yellow scheme now that I've gotten better at it. Starting with the shadow, I take some red miniature paint and mix it about half and half with some brown miniature paint. After mixing in much mustard miniature paint, it's not looking orange enough, so I add in more red. Since I'm using a disposable wet palette, I clean the back end of my brush on the exposed paper towel. When it comes to base coating, the trick is to just do it. That's it. During this time, I like to listen to YouTube videos where people talk about 40k lore or the hobby sphere. But streaming shows that have a lot of talking or where the action is not very important are also great hobby companions too. Also I do a second coat since the first one didn't cover super well. There is a weird nub on the side of the hood part that I forgot to clean off earlier. No problem, I'll just cut it off and no one will be the wiser. For the mid-tone, I mixed in some yellow, but it wasn't much brighter than the shadow color, so I mixed in more yellow in about another half and half mix. At first, I started applying this just like the first blue highlight. The thing is, with the blue, the darkest shade is the mid-tone. That's because more than half of the blue is still the original base coat color. But I want this to read as yellow, not orange, so I extend the coverage of this mid-tone over more of the orange base coat. For the highlight, I use the mustard yellow color straight up, alternating between layering and glazing to get quick transitions. While I have yellow on my palette, I use it to base coat the eyes. I spilled some yellow on one of them, but it's easy to clean up by glazing some black craft paint. For the Death Watch, which I base coated off camera, I mixed black and white half and half into a medium gray. Same as before, I layer on the highlights, then glaze towards them with the same gray mixture. All of the armor colors are done. Time for the details. To base coat the leather, I use a brown miniature paint. The ability to unmagnetize this Tyranid arm is so useful for painting. While base coating, I noticed some chunky flat areas in between some of the pouches that need to be recess shaded, so I quickly hit them with another glaze of black craft paint. Now I'd like to introduce you to my favorite brown paint. Only the highest quality paint right here, folks. At first, I tried layering and spreading it out like I would any other paint, but I soon switched to a scratchier approach. It's closer to a thin layer consistency, but this light brown is covering more like a glaze due to it being a craft paint. I mixed the brown miniature paint from the base coat with a light tan miniature paint, about half and half. But the value was too light, so I darkened it with another helping of brown. Instead of traditional edge highlighting, I dotted the edges to give a scuffed appearance. Then I tidied up some of the highlights in the middle of the large pouches with brown. I also smoothed out the gradient on the first pouch. Here is the pouch marine before and after highlighting. Quite the difference. Okay, the next major colors are white, red, and light tan. First up is painting the parchment paper parts. I'm base coating with the same light brown craft paint I used on the leather. The first coat is pretty abysmal, but the second coat clears that right up. Also, I did a third coat. The mid-tone is a simple mixture of the shadow and highlight colors. You'll never guess what ratio I used. I applied this in 2 thin layers, the second covering less in order to build up a gradient. Then I highlight with the highlight color. Just wanted to highlight that. The Tyranid skulls are painted with the same colors. I always enjoy highlighting skulls. They have a nice mixture of smooth curves and sharp edges to really play around with. For the red parts, I started with a mixture of red miniature paint and black craft paint. Then I worked up to a pure red through 1 or 2 coats. I mix my light tan into the red to make a pink for the highlight. One strategy to make a red highlight is to mix in a yellowish color to tint the red towards orange as it gets brighter. But for my Space Marines, I prefer pink as it provides a cold feeling that is more in line with their scheme of cool colors. Also, I really enjoyed painting these storm bolters. One side has a chamfer with double edges, while the other side has a smooth convex fillet. When it comes to painting white, the tricky part is nothing because it's actually quite easy. Just 2 thin coats. That's it. The reason I can get such good coverage out of it, besides it being a mini paint, is because of the metallic undercoat. Silver is very bright, and can cover in just 1 coat, so it's the perfect foundation for building up white, ivory, yellow, or any bright color. And I don't even have to apply it because it was the first step of this painting process. It is important to start with an off-white though. You can't brighten pure white any more than you can darken pure black. They're absolutes. On this Intercessor's banner, I wanted a bit more depth of value, so I darkened my off-white a bit. And I didn't even use a 50-50 ratio. I know, shocker. The light blue paint I mixed in ended up not showing up at all, but that's okay. Now I know for next time. Back to the eyes. The eyes that will see their enemies broken. With most of them base coated, all I need to do is dry brush them, then highlight. I don't have a standardized color for my Space Marine eyes. I figure since they're individuals, they would probably have their own individual preferences. There are some blue spots on the silver here and there. The silver I used is translucent, so I hit it up with some black instead, to get it in 1 coat. No need to actually put down silver though. The black looks like a metallic shadow or something. And while I'm at it, I hit up all the joints as well. I have my Intercessor Sergeant here, and I think it would look cool with a checker on his left knee, just like the one I put on this Terminator off screen. After some freehanding, I have a result I'm happy with. However, I must have had some serious tunnel vision, because I put it on the wrong guy. Oops. Well, now 2 guys have knee checkers. Speaking of 2 of my Intercessors have exposed faces. Just like at carnivals, face painting can be fun and fast. They also help to ground the miniature in reality, so it doesn't just look like a clump of walking armor. The transitions on the face are not the best, but from a distance, I doubt anyone will notice. Because there are so many skin tones among you humans, I don't bother recording any recipes. Instead, I wing it with a new blend of colors each time. Whoops, almost forgot the hair. I'm no expert, but I don't think humans have chrome hair. Here I've got some extra cables that I installed. An important thing to remember is that if you go to the trouble to do custom work, you want it to stand out so people notice it. So I decided to go with a punchy scheme of black and yellow stripes. As you may have noticed earlier, I'm not super concerned with having perfect brush control. As long as the stripes have consistent intervals, I think it'll look fine. Also, the gradient that I'm purposefully leaving behind as I work up to a yellow will blur the lines between the stripes, which will help hide the imperfections. Finally, the Marines are done. All that's left to do are the bases. It didn't take long to decide on green for this metal plate. It's a color that I haven't used much on the Marines, and the rivets make it look like part of an Imperial Guard tank or something. By the way, this plate was made from an impression I took of a model train car. One of the nice things about working on bases is that you can be a bit splotchier, and it will all just look like weathering. Once I've dry brushed the brightest green, I watered down the same orange paint I used on the striped cables and use it as rust. When dry, I dab some light green here and there to break up the obvious waterline left behind. I come back in with a second coat of orange to dial up that oxidized vibrancy. Now it's on to the main color of the bases. I'm using the same light brown craft paint I used for the shadow of the paper and the skull parts. But there's no need to be neat and get uniform coverage, just slap it everywhere. I recreate the mid-tone that I used on the paper and dry brush it. Craft paint makes a great foundation for dry brushing on bases like this, because the uneven coverage leads to patches where the black primer is still showing through. This to me looks more natural than a uniform base coat. You could probably achieve a similar result with a black wash over miniature paint, but I don't really see the need when they can both be replaced with a single messy coat of $1 craft paint. It's less money and less steps, and less accuracy. I mean, it's a win-win-win. The brown with the tan dry brushing made for a good foundation for the skulls. All I have to do is come back in with some manual highlighting with the same color I used to dry brush with, then I finish them off with some light tan. The last detail on the minis? The Tyranid parts. I hope to purchase the new Leviathan box, and if I do, I need to come up with a scheme now if I want these parts to match the Tyranid half. I also want to slap chop these out, but I don't have any contrast or speed paints or any transparent miniature paint. Luckily though, I have good old-fashioned craft paint to fall back on. Look at this is professional quality paint right here. Can't waste any of this sweet nectar. Back in the bottle you go. My red craft paint tends to look a little magenta pinkish over white, so I try mixing in 1 part yellow craft paint for each 2 red parts. Even with a third of the mixture being yellow, the color still looks a tad pinkish to me. I base coat the claws with the same light brown I've been using for all the other brown parts. Then I work up in value by adding in more and more white with each passing layer. I mix in more yellow into the red mixture and use that as a highlight on the red flesh. Something about the warm patches on the cold red base coat strikes my fancy. I'm definitely going with this color scheme in the future. With all that done, the final step is to paint the rims of the bases with a dark brown. And the final step is to varnish. All done. Time to take them off the painting handles. Oh my. What do we have here? It seems that the foam tape's adhesive has adhered itself to the bases. They can even stick to my hand now. Man, they can even stick to each other. Well, at least I learned something. Now it's time for the beauty shots. This was certainly quite the project for me. The sheer amount of detail they possess made the process absolutely grueling compared to normal Marines, but it was all worth it. I can't wait to use them in a game of 10th edition, or maybe one-page rules once the codices come out. This project has inspired me to complete even more of my hobby backlog, and I hope you've been inspired too. Until next time, have a good one.